Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Secrets of Healthful Motherhood Summit. My name is Vera Stepina. I'm your host, and today I'm introducing you to another expert. His name is Jeffrey Smith. Jeffrey Smith is an American consumer activist. He's a self-published author and a politician. He's also a filmmaker. He's the author of 2 books on genetically engineered foods, and he's been working with organic food marketers and alternative health product promoters to advocate against genetically modified food. I'm very excited to have Jeffrey with us today. Jeffrey, hi, how are you?
Very good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. The reason I asked you to be on this interview with me today is I think it's very important for all of the moms out there to know about GMOs and to fully understand what those are, what they do, and why we have them. So I figured, you would be the best person to tell us about all of this.
Great. Yes, genetically engineered foods. You may be hearing more about it, and you may be seeing the label non-GMO on products. It's very important for moms to know this, starting from even before they get pregnant if they can, and avoid GMOs, not only for themselves but especially for children who are most at risk. The genetically engineered foods are foods that are largely engineered in crop form not to die when sprayed with a poisonous weed killer, mostly Roundup. And these crops then get drenched in Roundup, and then they have high Roundup residues, and Roundup is linked to all sorts of diseases. You don't want to be taking crops with Roundup residues. The other crops are engineered to produce a toxic insecticide that actually breaks open little holes in the stomach walls of insects to kill them. It's now known to break open little holes in human cells, not a good idea to put in your mouth. Now, the process of genetic engineering to make these type of crops causes all sorts of damage in the DNA of the plants. So, for example, let's say you want to create a corn plant that produces its own toxic insecticide. The insecticide is called Bt toxin. You would take a gene from bacteria that normally exists in the soil that produces a natural insecticide, and you shoot millions of these genes into a plate of millions of cells, and then clone those cells into a plant, and now every single cell of those plants has a little gene-sized spray bottle producing a toxic pesticide. You also end up messing up the DNA dramatically in the crop, which can cause new allergens or toxins, etc. So this is the basic science behind it, but what turns out is the politics is very, very dangerous. It's as dangerous as the science. The FDA scientists had repeatedly warned their superiors that GMOs were dangerous and could lead to allergies, toxins, new diseases, nutritional problems, and urged them to require long-term testing before they were exposed to humans. Of course, children are most at risk. But the FDA was under orders from the White House to promote GMOs, and so they ignored the scientists. They put in charge of policy the former attorney to Monsanto, who's the big GMO company, and that person oversaw a policy that falsely claimed that the agency didn't see any difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, and therefore no safety studies were necessary and no labeling was necessary. So the entire approval and promotion of GMOs was based on a lie, was based on the unscientific overriding of the concerns by the scientists, and now we see overwhelming evidence showing that GMOs should never have been put on the market and are probably related to a large number of diseases and disorders.
This is crazy. There's so much information out there. There's so many sources, and all of that is so conflicting. There's some scientists that say there's nothing wrong about, genetically modified foods because you just take one gene from a stronger plant and, inject it in a different one. And this is the whole process. So it's safe and, we can eat it and it's going to save our foods and everything.
Well, let's take a look at what we know. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine reviewed the animal feeding studies on GMOs 6 years ago and said that there is enough evidence of harm in these animals compared to controls to justify all doctors prescribing non-GMO diets to all patients. They said the animals were suffering from gastrointestinal disorders, immune system problems, reproductive problems, organ damage, accelerated aging, problems with cholesterol and insulin regulation. And they were very concerned. Now, thousands of doctors are prescribing non-GMO diets to their patients, and many of them and their patients and others who are simply avoiding GMOs based on what they learn, they're avoiding GMOs, and they're saying, many of them, that they get better from the same types of diseases and disorders that were afflicting the lab animals. So reproductive, immune, and accelerated aging, digestion in particular. And I've interviewed thousands of people, especially from the stage. I've interviewed the audiences and said, okay, who has gotten rid of GMOs and feels better? And I can tell you from over 100 lectures doing this that the number one complaint that people say consistently gets better is gastrointestinal disorders. The next one is they get more energy and less brain fog. Then there's a long list of others that follow, which includes immune system problems of all types, weight problems, headaches, skin conditions, mental conditions, and all of these are very, very common. In fact, when we do surveys of people, these come up on a regular basis. When livestock are taken off of GMOs, they too get better from these type of diseases and disorders, and these are the same diseases and disorders that are on the rise in the U.S. population since GMOs were introduced. Now, that's a very significant set of overlapping data. But if you look just at the two main toxins in GMOs, for example, the Roundup herbicide that's soaked into these plants and the Bt toxin that's produced by some of them, if you just look at those specific toxins and their properties, as many scientists have, it can explain all of these type of diseases and disorders. And we have these charts that show that the introduction and expanded use of GMOs correlates with the rise in parallel with deaths from senile dementia and stroke and obesity and intestinal infection and also autism and diabetes and many, many types of cancers, including leukemia and liver and kidney and irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel, and anxiety and schizophrenia, etc. And we also understand now the biochemistry of, for example, why Roundup might be causing these type of problems.
Wow, so you're saying that GMOs or consuming GMOs can actually lead to obesity just as well?
Oh, yeah, there's a number of reasons, and I can give you some examples as to why that be the case. We can pick anything. We could pick gluten sensitivity. We can pick kidney failure. We can pick growth of cancers, and we can drill down and show a number of overlapping causations or indicators that GMOs are responsible. We can look at animal feeding studies. We look at the biochemistry and the changes in the body because of Roundup. We can look at epidemiological studies showing that its use correlates with the rise of those diseases or disorders. You can see them overlapping over and over again. Now, if you look at the industry-funded studies, it's basically tobacco science. We've shown very clearly in my second book called Genetic Roulette, The Documented Health Risks of Genetically Engineered Foods, there's a 41-page section which basically catches the industry red-handed, rigging their research, designing it to avoid finding problems. And even after they design it to be superficial and not particularly helpful in finding problems, they still find problems. Higher doubling of death rates, increase this, decrease that, and then they just write it off with unscientific defenses, which independent scientists just scream about, but the industry has literally billions of dollars, and they have a very, very well-funded publicity program so that, for example, independent scientists who raise issues, they're often attacked, threatened. Those that discover problems, they're definitely attacked and threatened. And this was not just me saying it, it's written up in Nature, a prominent scientific journal, that this happens consistently. And I have interviewed scientists who've discovered problems and have been fired from their jobs or denied tenure or lost their status or lost their funding or had their laboratories locked on them because of the immense capacity of the biotech industry to control the research agenda at universities around this country and other places. And it's very, very well documented. You can read the book Seeds of Deception, my first book, which describes one of these cases in detail and several others as well. And yet, in spite of this clear evidence that the biotech industry is rigging their research and hiding evidence from independent scientists, they also have tremendous control in the government. So, for example, back when the FDA had Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, in charge of policy, Michael Taylor then went to work for Monsanto as their vice president, and he's now back at the FDA in charge of food safety. He is Obama's food safety czar. The person who was the biotech governor of the year, Tom Vilsack, he's in charge of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There's a biotech guy who was in charge of the U.S. Agency for International Development, another person that negotiates on behalf of the United States for agricultural deals around the world. He was a lobbyist for the biotech industry. So we can't get the government to condemn or ban or do reasonable research on biotech because the GMO people are in the government. And so that's why we're educating consumers so that they can make healthier choices, as well as their physicians so they can prescribe healthier non-GMO diets to their patients.
That is crazy what you mentioned just about GMO people being in the government and FDA and USDA, because I've been watching a lot of documentaries on GMOs. One of them was, what's the name, GMO OMG or OMG GMO, you know which one I'm talking about. And that's exactly what they're talking about, how many people control what we eat, but they actually have a very big interest in promoting GMOs to people. So
absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, if anyone at this point from the industry were to tell you that GMOs will feed the world, if they really are scientific, if they really are informed, then you can know now that they're lying, or being incredibly naive, because the world's experts on feeding the world have already convened and done the most comprehensive evaluation of how to feed the world. And they uniformly, over 400 scientists with a document signed on by 59 countries, say that GMOs have nothing to offer today to feed the hungry world or eradicate poverty or establish sustainable agriculture. If you hear that someone says GMOs will increase yield, they're also uninformed. GMOs do not increase yield, according to the USDA, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, according to the research. If they say GMOs are over-regulated, it turns out the FDA has abdicated, not regulated. They allow Monsanto, who told us that Agent Orange and DDT and PCBs were safe, they allow that company to determine on its own whether GMOs are safe without even telling the FDA or consumers. It's not over-regulated at all. It's basically a wild, wild west. So you said earlier that you hear so many things. Yes, there is a multi-million-dollar disinformation program that's being dispatched all over the world, especially in the United States. And unfortunately, these guys know how to lie in a convincing manner. And we have caught them lying, we have documented it, and we have it all over our website at responsibletechnology.org. There, under the fraud tab, you can read the actual statements by the FDA scientists that were made public because of a lawsuit, where they basically complain and argue and say, this should not be our policy, that we just allow GMOs on the market without any safety studies. It's not scientifically justifiable. It's dangerous. And yet, that is the policy.
So let me ask you this question. As I've been reading and researching, it seems like the genetically modified organisms are pretty much everywhere. So even if you wanted to grow your own yard or, your own garden, I mean, it's not even that easy to find the seeds that are GMO-free. So if I were to buy organic seeds, can I be sure that those are going to be GMO-free at all?
Organic is not allowed to be intentionally GMOs, whether it's food or seed. And if you're thinking about seed, you only have a few products that are genetically engineered. And everyone should know that there are very few products out there, edibles, that have been genetically engineered and commercialized. They want to genetically engineer everything, literally all food, all insects, livestock, grasses, trees. They want to replace nature. And this is basically comes from the consultant to Monsanto in 1999, where he said the ideal future of Monsanto's executives, as described to them by those executives, was to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds and patent them. And then since then, the biotech industry is now genetically engineering fish and livestock and insects, etc. The 9 GMO crops are soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, zucchini, and yellow squash. And these are all described on our website, non-GMO shopping guide Now, these 9, unfortunately, are also found in many processed foods, most processed foods, because most processed foods will contain a derivative of soy and corn, and maybe cottonseed oil or canola oil, or sugar from sugar beets. Also, the meat and milk and dairy and eggs in the United States are from animals that have largely been eating genetically modified seeds and crops like the soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa. Now, I want to speak to mothers very specifically about GMOs and what we have found. I'm going to share some stories. And these stories, I can go into the scientific reasons that could justify why these stories are true and GMO related, but I think the stories would be good to share during the short period of time that we have. I was speaking at MIT with an MIT senior scientist who had talked about the dangers of GMOs and linked it to all of these different diseases and disorders. And this was glyphosate or Roundup. And I asked the audience about their experience avoiding GMOs and if they noticed anything that improved. And a woman stood up and said her 6.5-year-old was violent and out of control. And they were going to kick him out of school. And she told me later they were going to call him retarded and label him that. And that she watched my film, Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives, and decided to completely change his diet. Because in the film, there are parents of 3 autistic children, three sets of parents, 3 autistic sons, who describe how the behavior and gastrointestinal disorders of their sons got dramatically better when they kicked GMOs out. So she was interested. She learned about leaky gut. She learned about all these different aspects of GMOs that are in the film Genetic Roulette, took her kid, her 6.5-year-old boy, off of GMOs, switched his diet completely. She said within a week, all the problems disappeared. Within a month, she had a new son. Now, I have heard stories like this over and over again. A person who was actually volunteering at my table at a conference was there. She said, I'll tell you my story. I saw your movie, and it completely changed my life. And I said to my son and daughter, if you do anything for me in this life because I ask you to, please watch this film. She was very concerned about her grandchildren. Her son said, okay, I've watched the film. I agree. I'm going to take our son, your grandson, off of GMOs. Now, up until that point, he had been absolutely acting out like crazy, constantly getting calls from the school, and he also had a very significant breathing problem, an asthma problem. They switched him to a non-GMO diet. None of those behavioral problems persisted, and he no longer needed the spray for asthma. She said the only time that they get phone calls from the school or see problems is the day after the grandson eats at the other grandparent's house, because there he eats the other foods. Now, I originally, when I heard these type of stories 10 years ago, and I've been doing this for 20 years, just about 20 years, when I heard these stories about people noticing a difference with GMOs, I was skeptical. But then I started hearing it from doctors who had been prescribing non-GMO diets to literally thousands of patients and noticed an improvement on all these things. And then I became a believer. At that point, I was speaking about the dangers of GMOs. I was writing about it, but I did not expect it to be so obvious. But for some of the population, it appears to be very obvious. In fact, one doctor said that if someone has mental conditions that are associated with it, those clear up right away. The immune system issues like allergies can be 3 to 7 days. The gastrointestinal usually are better in 2 months, and then it can be improved over 2 years. She had a very specific timetable based on prescribing non-GMO diets to 5,000 people. I'm putting out a film very soon, and I want people to sign up on our newsletter so that they can be alerted to the film about a family with an even more dramatic transformation. I don't want to talk about the details now, but this family had 21 chronic conditions between the 5 of them, and I'd like you to see what happens in this film that we're producing when they switch to non-GMO. So go to responsibletechnology.org, sign up for the newsletter, and as soon as this is done and made available, I will let you know. It's a very dramatic story, and I don't want to give it away, but it's really important for people to know. Children are most at risk, and if you look, for example, at just one piece of research, they found the Bt toxin. That's the toxin that breaks open little holes in the walls of insects to kill them, that pokes holes in human cells. They found the Bt toxin in the blood of 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada and 80% of their unborn fetuses. A toxin in their blood that has been known in other studies to be toxic to blood cells. It gets into the unborn fetus. If there's no blood-brain barrier, it might get into the brain. It might be toxic to the brain. It might poke holes there. It's also known as an allergen, or it creates allergic responses in mammals and humans, according to peer-reviewed published studies. It's in our diet. It's in our diet. And in fact, if you look at the Bt toxin in the blood, 93% of the pregnant women tested, it's supposed to wash out very quickly. So the researchers were wondering what was the source of Bt toxin in the blood. It was the constant source in Canada. They're not eating tortillas every day like they do in Mexico. So they guessed it was the milk and meat of animals that they were eating every day, because the animals were eating the Bt corn as part of their diet. But another explanation might be that when they eat the corn chip, inside the corn chip, the corn is made from Bt corn and Roundup Ready corn. So it's sprayed with Roundup that kills gut bacteria, that does all these things. It's an antibiotic, it's an endocrine disruptor. But it also, in the corn, it produces Bt toxin. Now, the gene that produces that toxin might transfer to the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines. There's a lot of bacteria in our intestines. A trillion cells or more, 10 trillion. So the gene that produces the Bt toxin may transfer to the gut bacteria, and it might continue to function, meaning it might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, and that might explain why 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada had Bt toxin in their blood, because they might have been producing it inside their own intestines by their bacteria. Now, we know the only human feeding study ever conducted on commercialized GMOs found that genes do in fact transfer from GMOs to gut bacteria. They did not confirm that it still functioned, so that's speculation. We know that genes can transfer to gut bacteria, but they stopped the test as soon as they found out. They didn't follow up to see if the Bt gene transferred or if it was producing Bt toxin. But these are the kind of dangers that we're facing, unprecedented dangers, eating these foods. And children, if you look at all the aspects of GMOs, the allergens, the toxins, the nutritional problems, they are most at risk. Children below the age of 2 especially are highly more susceptible than adults at allergic reactions. Toxins affect children far more. Nutritional problems affect children far more. They don't have a blood-brain barrier well developed. They don't have a gut bacteria situation well developed. And even the parent eating GMOs before the child is born may have an influence in a number of ways. And I don't need to go into that. It's a little technical, but it's from the blood that goes into the kid. It's even from the gut bacteria that is inoculated by the mother into the child. That could be changed because of GMOs, because Roundup is an antibiotic killing beneficial gut bacteria. So I'm getting a little technical. I'll stop here. Go ahead.
Well, this is simply just plainly crazy. Everything, that can happen or might happen to you. My other question is that, so you said, you mentioned all of the 9 types of GMO foods, and one of the foods that is not on the list, but I wanted to ask you about it. We eat a lot of bread, right? We eat a lot of flour products, whatever. Can there be traces of GMOs in the wheat because of the cross-pollination and everything?
Not because of cross-pollination. There can be traces of GMOs in grains, etc., that carry, ships that'll carry a GMO and then they'll carry a wheat. But the wheat situation is a little different. Wheat is not genetically engineered at this point. It is selectively bred, but it is not genetically engineered. However, wheat, like many other grains and also some fruits and vegetables and beans, is sprayed with Roundup just before it is harvested. It kills down, or it dries down the plant. It kills it essentially. It causes the puffing up of the wheat so that it's a little bit heavier when it's harvested. It creates uniform ripening because it forces the wheat to ripen very quickly because the grain is about to die, so it puts all of its energy in creating the wheat for the next generation. But the Roundup that's sprayed on the wheat gets absorbed into the wheat plant and stored in the wheat kernel. So there's Roundup now in the U.S. wheat supply, and rice and barley and rye and lentils and whatnot. So if we want to avoid Roundup, and I strongly recommend that you do, it's not just good enough these days to buy non-GMO, it's also important to buy organic. Organic does not allow either GMOs or Roundup. And so for those that want to be doubly sure of protecting themselves and especially their children, switch to organic. And when you do, I highly recommend doing two things. One, take notes about the health and behavior and attention span of the children after switching to 100% organic for, watch the change over 2, 3, 4 weeks. And write it down and see the changes. And then please share it with us. Email me at healthy@responsibletechnology.org with those results. Healthy@responsibletechnology.org. I have heard so many testimonials. And the thing is, organic is more expensive than non-organic. If you buy organic processed foods, it's even more expensive. If you buy organic, raw fruits and vegetables, you can actually save money by going from processed foods to actual food ingredients. But the money that you may save from chronic disease care could be far greater, and also the quality of life could in itself justify the change with the increased energy, the better mood and behavior, etc. I mean, just one aspect of Roundup, for example. Roundup blocks the production of L-tryptophan because it blocks a certain metabolic pathway. Our gut bacteria uses L-tryptophan to produce serotonin. Serotonin is a mood and behavior. So our mood and behavior may be completely changed when we stop taking Roundup, because all of a sudden our gut bacteria can now support the production of serotonin. Serotonin also tells the body, stop eating, I'm full. So it might actually reduce how much we eat. It also controls blood sugar levels. The L-tryptophan also the thing that's blocked also influences melatonin, which influences sleep. Also dopamine, which influences things that are very important, depression, etc. So we have a situation where our hormones can be completely changed by eating these Roundup-drenched foods. So the key is you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to spend hours, in my case 2 decades, studying this. Just try it. Invest in it. Do a challenge for yourself and your family. Do an experiment. Take notes. And you may convince yourself, and you may become so convinced that you tell everyone you know. And in order to help get you convinced, I strongly recommend start it with a family viewing of Genetic Roulette, The Gamble of Our Lives. It has convinced more families to stop eating GMOs than any other documentary, than any other book, than any other tool that we know of. And it's a way to start the process so that as the family you do it together, and then meet about it and look at what your changes are. And that way, if you write it down, you won't forget.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. And I think it's very important that we educate ourselves, because I think the majority of our problems come from not knowing what we're buying, what we're doing. I went to Home Depot last week because I was buying some teas or something. And you can actually buy Roundup. It's right there on the shelf. And people voluntarily buy it to put it on their crops in their backyard.
Yes.
And so the same applies to fertilizers and everything else, because we just simply don't know what's in there, and it promises you this great results. You're going to have no insects, great yield or whatever. And we buy it because we think we're doing something better when in fact we're not doing anything much better at all.
Yes, it's true. And the thing is, people think they can just spray it without a problem and then it'll just go away. The active ingredient in Roundup can stay in the ground for literally decades. It can be biodegraded in months, years, or decades, depending on soil conditions. And the Roundup can be absorbed through the skin and end up in our bloodstream and end up in our bodies. And we have a situation in South America, in Argentina in particular, where they spray a lot of Roundup on these Roundup-ready crops. The cancer rate and birth defect rate of the peasant communities around the spraying has dramatically increased. In one large region, 300% increase in cancer, 400% increase in birth defects. In one smaller region with high concentrations of spraying, a 70-fold increase in birth defects. It is very serious. And not only that the kids that play in the yard can be exposed to it, but the dogs, and then the kids play with the dogs, and it can be there for a long time. So I strongly recommend being extremely careful when dealing with any poisons at the home. And my recommendation for Roundup, based on what I've read, is I wouldn't use it personally.
It's too many dangers around it, so we need to know more about it. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for coming out and sharing all of this with us. And I strongly recommend for everybody who was listening to us, go ahead and watch the movie, watch the documentary, and read the information on Jeffrey's website. And there's also a Facebook page that you can follow as well. And so this was Jeffrey Smith for the Secrets of Healthful Motherhood Summit. And my name is Vera Stepina. I hope we cleared things a little bit more for you. Jeffrey, thank you so much.
And thank you.
And we'll see you guys soon. Thank you so much.